In a quiet town nestled among the rolling hills of rural Alabama, there was a small diner that had stood the test of time, Tom's Diner. The faded sign above its door had witnessed decades of change. But the diner had always been a place where folks came to gather, share stories, and enjoy a good meal. It had been a fixture of the community for as long as anyone could remember. And for John Carter, it had always been a place where he felt welcome. But on that fateful day, everything would change. John Carter wasn't just any regular customer at Tom's Diner, he was a war veteran, respected by many in the town. His weathered face, marked by the years of service, often served as a reminder of the sacrifices made by men and women who had fought for their country. But that day, as John made his way into the diner, he felt an unfamiliar sense of unease in the air. The usual hum of chatter and laughter seemed to disappear, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. It was as though something was wrong, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. As he shuffled toward his usual seat at the counter, John noticed Tom Harris, the diner's owner, emerge from the kitchen. Tom's face, usually creased with a welcoming smile, was now hardened. His eyes, cold, distant, and sharp, met John's with an intensity that made the old veteran shift uncomfortably in his seat. A smile that had once been familiar to John was now absent. It was replaced by a hardness that made the air feel heavier. "What can I get for you today, John?" Tom's voice was rough, devoid of the usual warmth John had come to expect. His tone was clipped, and there was an edge to it that made John pause. John, always polite, tried to ignore the change in Tom's demeanor. "Just the usual, Tom. A cup of coffee and a slice of that famous apple pie of yours." But instead of the usual banter, a strange and uncomfortable tension seemed to hang in the air. Tom's jaw clenched, and his knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the counter. His response came quickly, and it wasn't what John had expected. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Tom said, his voice rising sharply. "We're out of pie today." John's brow furrowed in confusion. He could clearly see a freshly baked apple pie sitting on the counter just a few feet away. "But Tom, I can see it right there," John said, pointing to the pie. Tom's eyes narrowed, and his voice rose again, this time with more force. "I said, we're out. We're closing early today. You'll have to leave." The words hit John like a slap in the face. The atmosphere around him seemed to freeze. The other customers, who had once greeted him with friendly nods, now avoided his gaze. Some looked away, clearly uncomfortable, while others simply stared in silence. John, confused and hurt, slowly stood up from his stool, trying to comprehend what had just happened. "Tom, I don't understand. Have I done something to offend you?" John asked, his voice trembling slightly, unsure of what had triggered the sudden change in treatment. Tom's face twisted into a sneer, the hostility unmistakable. "You've done plenty. Just by walking in here," he spat. "I don't serve your kind in my establishment. Now get out, or I'll call the authorities." The words stung, and for a moment, John felt as though he had been transported back to a time when such treatment was all too common. His heart ached with the weight of the discrimination he had faced, not just that day, but throughout his life. The unfairness of it all, the bitter reminder of a world still rife with prejudice, left John reeling. As John made his way to the door, his shoulders slumped in defeat. A young woman at a nearby table stood up. Her voice, shaking with anger, broke the oppressive silence. "This isn't right," she shouted. "You can't treat him like this." Tom's face turned crimson with rage. "This is my diner, and I'll run it how I see fit. If you don't like it, you can leave too." The woman hesitated, clearly torn between doing what was right and her fear of confrontation. After a moment of inner turmoil, she sat back down, her face flushed with shame as she watched John leave the diner. Humiliated. As the door closed behind John, the diner erupted into a flurry of whispers. Some patrons hurriedly paid their bills and left, unwilling to support Tom's blatant discrimination. Others remained, either agreeing with Tom's actions or too shocked to move. It was a moment of reckoning for the town, one that would have repercussions far beyond the walls of Tom's diner. Unbeknownst to Tom, his actions that day would set in motion a series of events that would challenge the very foundations of the town and force its residents to confront their own biases. What Tom had assumed was a simple dismissal of a customer would become the catalyst for a profound change. And he would soon learn that the consequences of prejudice were far-reaching and often more than one could bear. As John made his way back to his truck, his mind was spinning. The warm sunlight that had once felt comforting now seemed to mock him. The world around him felt foreign, alien, just as it had when he first faced prejudice as a young soldier. He climbed into his truck, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. For a long moment, John sat there, staring blankly ahead, overwhelmed by the hurt and humiliation. But then, almost imperceptibly, something changed within him. His jaw set in determination. A fire kindled in his eyes. John Carter was not the kind of man to accept injustice without standing up for what was right. He wasn't about to let this moment go unchallenged. This wasn't just about him. This was about something bigger, a battle that needed to be fought. Not with anger, but with dignity and resolve. As the engine roared to life, John's mind was already working, formulating a plan. He had been kicked out of Tom's diner. But this was far from over. Little did Tom know, his actions would ignite a chain of events that would change their sleepy little town forever. And so began a story of redemption, of justice, and the unexpected ripple effects of one man's prejudice. What happened next would teach everyone involved an important lesson, one that no one would ever forget. The next morning, Tom Harris woke up early, as he always did, to prepare for another day at his diner. The quiet town of Willow Creek was still sleepy at this hour. The streets bathed in the golden light of dawn. Yet, something was off. A tense energy hung in the air, thicker than the usual morning fog. As he opened the door to Tom's diner, he saw a small group of people standing outside, holding signs that read "No to Racism and Equality for All." Tom's heart sank. He knew, deep down, that yesterday's events had set something in motion, something far bigger than he had ever anticipated. He had refused service to John Carter, the town's beloved veteran, and in doing so, he had unknowingly set off a storm of dissent. His pride still burned hot from his actions, and he couldn't shake the anger that had fueled him the day before. Yet, now, with people standing at his door, demanding answers, he couldn't help but feel a sickening knot in his stomach. He had always prided himself on being a man of his word, standing by the values his father had instilled in him. But what now? The crowd outside was growing, their presence undeniable. This wasn't going to blow over as he had hoped. Tom reluctantly unlocked the door and stepped inside, trying to go about his usual routine. But his mind was far from the tasks at hand. The unsettling silence of the diner was broken only by the occasional jingle of the bell above the door, each sound sending a jolt through him. His eyes darted nervously toward the door, half expecting John or the police to walk in. But as the morning wore on, no one came. No one. That is, until the lunch rush. Just as the door jingled again, Tom's stomach churned. He looked up to see a man he didn't recognize. The stranger was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with a quiet authority that immediately set Tom on edge. The man walked toward the counter, his eyes scanning the diner before locking onto Tom's face. "Are you Tom Harris?" he asked, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of steel. Tom nodded, his throat dry. He could feel his heart race. The stranger's next words hit him like a punch. "I'm Michael Carter," the man said, and Tom's face drained of color. "I believe we need to have a conversation about what happened here yesterday." Tom's mind raced. The name struck him like a bolt of lightning: John Carter's son, a prominent U.S. senator, Tom had heard whispers about him but had dismissed them as small-town gossip. But now, standing before him, Michael Carter was a reality Tom wasn't sure he was prepared for. "What do you want?" Tom asked, his voice gruff. Michael's gaze hardened, but his voice remained eerily calm. "What you did yesterday wasn't just morally wrong. It was illegal. And I intend to make sure you face the consequences for it." Tom's jaw clenched. "I have the right to refuse service to anyone I choose. This is my diner. My business." Michael's expression remained neutral, but the weight of his words was clear. "Is that so? And on what grounds did you refuse service to my father? A decorated veteran who has served this country with honor?" Tom flinched. The room fell silent, and the air felt thick with tension. He knew he was standing on the precipice of something much bigger than a simple dispute over food. He had made a mistake, one he wasn't sure how to fix. "I don't have to explain myself to you." Tom spat. "Your father and people like him aren't welcome here." Michael's voice was steady, but beneath it simmered a quiet fury. "Mr. Harris, I'm not just John Carter's son. I'm a U.S. Senator. And I have dedicated my career to fighting against the kind of bigotry you've displayed. What you did yesterday is not just a personal insult, it's a public one." Tom's face turned pale as the full weight of Michael's words sank in. He had made the mistake of kicking out the father of a U.S. Senator. And in doing so, he had unknowingly put himself in the crosshairs of a political storm. "Let me be clear," Michael continued, his voice a low growl. "I will use every resource I have to ensure you face the consequences for your actions." Tom's bravado faltered. "You can't do anything to me," he muttered, trying to muster some defense. But the fear in his voice was unmistakable. "This is my diner." Michael leaned in, his voice soft but laced with menace. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The door swung open behind Michael, and he turned to leave. "You'll be hearing from me soon, Mr. Harris," he said, the words hanging in the air like a promise. As the door closed behind Michael, the diner erupted into a frenzy of whispers. Tom stood there, frozen, his hands shaking as the realization of his actions began to sink in. He had thought he was standing up for his beliefs, his father's beliefs, but now, in the face of Michael's words, he wasn't so sure. The rest of the afternoon was filled with tension. Tom tried to go about his business, but the din of judgment hung heavy in the air. Regular customers avoided his gaze, and many of them left early. Tom knew it was just a matter of time before the full weight of his actions came crashing down. Meanwhile, Michael's mind was already working on a plan. He knew he couldn't let this stand. What had happened at Tom's diner wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger, systemic issue of racism and discrimination that needed to be confronted head-on. And Michael was determined to lead that charge. The next morning, the tension in Willow Creek was palpable. Word of the previous day's events at Tom's diner had spread like wildfire, and the town was buzzing with hushed conversations. Michael Carter, fully aware of the ripple effect his father's treatment had caused, spent the early hours of the day on the phone, organizing his next steps. He was determined to turn this injustice into an opportunity for change. Meanwhile, back at the diner, Tom Harris stood behind the counter, trying his best to keep up with the morning rush. But despite the usual clatter of plates and cups, his mind was elsewhere. He hadn't slept much the night before, haunted by the events of the previous day and the unexpected confrontation with Michael Carter. His hands shook as he poured coffee, his thoughts clouded by a growing sense of dread. The door jingled again, and this time, it wasn't just the usual group of regulars trickling in. A few people entered, but their faces were stiff, their usual warmth replaced by a guarded silence. Tom could feel their eyes on him, their disapproval hanging in the air. For the first time, he felt like an outsider in his own diner. He had always prided himself on running a tight ship, a place where people felt like they belonged. But now, everything was different. The community was starting to turn on him. He could feel it in the way people spoke about him behind his back. In the way they hesitated before entering his establishment. The walls that had once felt so familiar and comforting now seemed to close in on him. As the morning wore on, Tom's mind raced. What had he done? His actions had been driven by a misguided sense of pride. A desire to uphold what he believed to be right. But now, in the cold light of day, he realized how wrong he had been. He had allowed his own prejudice, deeply ingrained from years of bitterness and loss, to cloud his judgment. But it wasn't just about his own mistakes anymore, it was about the damage he had done to the town, to his reputation, and, most importantly, to John Carter. Outside, the protests had grown in size. More people gathered, some holding signs, others talking quietly amongst themselves. Tom watched from the window, his heart heavy. He knew that whatever was coming next, he wouldn't be able to escape it. As if to confirm his worst fears, just after the lunch rush, the door jingled again. This time, it wasn't just another regular customer. A tall man in a sharp suit stood in the doorway. Tom's heart skipped a beat when he recognized him. It was Michael Carter, John's son. And the tension in the room seemed to thicken instantly. Michael walked to the counter with purpose, his eyes scanning the room before they landed on Tom. "Mr. Harris," he said, his voice cold and measured. "We need to talk." Tom's throat tightened, and he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had no idea what Michael was going to do. But one thing was clear, his actions the day before had set off a chain of events that would change everything. "I think you know why I'm here," Michael continued, his tone firm but not unkind. "What you did yesterday was a disgrace. My father is a veteran. He has served this country. And you treated him like dirt." Tom swallowed hard, his pride faltering under the weight of Michael's words. He had tried to justify his actions. But now he realized how little those justifications mattered. He couldn't hide behind his beliefs any longer. The truth was undeniable. "I was wrong," Tom muttered, his voice barely a whisper. He had spent so many years convinced that his way of thinking was right, that the world had to bend to his view. But now, standing before Michael, he understood how wrong he had been. Michael's eyes softened, just slightly, but there was no mistaking the fire that still burned behind them. "What you did wasn't just wrong, Tom. It was illegal. And you need to face the consequences for it." Tom stiffened. He knew Michael had the power to make things difficult for him. He had heard the whispers about Michael's political career, his work on civil rights and veterans issues. Tom had never imagined that one day, those whispers would turn into a reality that stood in his own diner. "I'm sorry," Tom said again, his voice cracking. "I don't know what else to say. I let my father's hatred cloud my judgment. I've spent so many years holding on to that anger. And now I've hurt people." Michael nodded, his expression still serious. "You've hurt more than just my father. You've hurt this entire town. And now, it's time for you to make things right." As Michael left the diner, the weight of the conversation settled heavily on Tom's shoulders. He had no idea what the future would hold. But one thing was certain, things could never go back to the way they were. He had a choice to make, a choice to either hold on to his old ways or change for the better. The road ahead would be difficult. But Tom knew, deep down, that it was the only way forward. The following days felt like a blur to Tom Harris. The weight of his actions hung over him like a dark cloud, one that refused to dissipate no matter how hard he tried to focus on his work. He could no longer escape the fact that he had made a grave mistake. The town, once warm and familiar, now seemed distant and cold. His diner, which had been a place of comfort for so many years, had become the epicenter of a storm he wasn't prepared for. Every time the bell above the door jingled, Tom braced himself, expecting another confrontation, another reminder of the harm he had caused. And it didn't help that his once loyal customers seemed to be avoiding him. The diner felt emptier with each passing day. And Tom could feel the eyes of his community upon him. Judgment heavy in the air. He couldn't escape the growing sense of shame that had settled in his chest. The morning after Michael's visit, Tom sat at the counter, his face pale as he absent-mindedly wiped down the surface. His mind was racing, each thought louder than the last. What had he done? Could he fix this? Could he even forgive himself? He didn't have the answers, and that terrified him. But just as the diner was beginning to empty out, a familiar face appeared at the door. Sarah, his longtime waitress, entered with a concerned look on her face. She had been working at the diner for years, and like so many others, she had seen the shift in Tom's demeanor since the incident. But unlike the other customers, Sarah wasn't afraid to speak her mind. "Tom," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "we need to talk." Tom looked up at her, his eyes weary. "What about?" "Sarah, I can't keep quiet about this," she began, her gaze unwavering. "What happened yesterday? With Mr. Carter, it wasn't right. But I can see you're struggling with it. And I want to help you. You've been a good man, Tom. But you have to confront what you did." Tom sat back in his chair, feeling a knot form in his stomach. He didn't want to hear it. He knew it was coming. But he wasn't ready to face the truth. Still, he couldn't ignore Sarah's sincerity. She had been there through the ups and downs of the diner's history, and she knew him better than most. If anyone could make him see reason, it was her. "I was wrong," Tom said, his voice thick with regret. "I was raised to believe that people like John weren't worth my time. I never thought about the harm I was doing. Now I see it. And I don't know how to make it right." Sarah's eyes softened, and she walked over to the counter, placing her hand gently on his. "The first step is admitting it, Tom. But you can't just leave it there. You need to show people that you're willing to change." Tom looked up at her, feeling the weight of her words. "But how? How do I make it right? How do I undo the damage I've done?" Sarah's expression was calm, yet filled with an understanding that seemed to pierce through the fog in his mind. "It's not about undoing the damage, Tom. It's about moving forward. It's about showing people that you've learned and that you're willing to grow. You don't have to do it alone. But you do have to start somewhere." For the first time since that fateful day, Tom felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. Sarah was right, he couldn't undo the past. But he could change the future. It would be hard, and it would take time. But he knew now that he had to try. That night, Tom couldn't sleep. The guilt gnawed at him. But it was joined by something else, determination. He had spent his entire life clinging to the beliefs passed down from his father. But now he realized that he didn't want to live like that anymore. He wanted to be better. He wanted to make things right. The next morning, Tom made a decision. He would go to John Carter and apologize, really apologize. He would take the first step toward breaking the cycle of hate and ignorance that had controlled his life for so long. He didn't know what the future would hold. But he knew he couldn't continue living the way he had. He stood up, took a deep breath, and walked out the door. It was time to make things right. Tom Harris arrived at John Carter's house that afternoon with a heavy heart. His steps were slow, each one weighed down by doubt and uncertainty. As he walked up the front steps, the memories of his past actions flooded his mind. The hurt in John's eyes, and the shame that had taken root in his own heart. Tom had spent the better part of the morning rehearsing his words. But now that he was standing on John's doorstep, they all seemed to vanish. He raised his hand to knock, hesitated for a moment, and then gently rapped on the door. It wasn't long before John appeared, his weathered face softening as he saw who stood before him. For a moment, there was only silence between them, the tension thick in the air. John's gaze was guarded, but there was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet sadness that made Tom's stomach twist. "Tom," John said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of caution. "What brings you here?" Tom swallowed, trying to steady his nerves. "John, I need to apologize, he said, his voice unsteady. I've been thinking about what happened at the diner. And I know that what I did was wrong. I can't take it back. But I can learn from it. I was wrong to treat you that way. And I want to make things right. John didn't immediately respond. Instead, he studied Tom with a thoughtful expression. It was clear that he was weighing the sincerity of Tom's words. And Tom's heart raced, wondering if John would ever be able to forgive him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, John spoke. It's not about just saying you're sorry, Tom. It's about proving it. Showing that you've changed. Not just in words but in actions. Tom nodded, his hands trembling slightly. I know. And I will. I've been a fool, John. I was blinded by the way I was raised. And I allowed that prejudice to shape who I was. But I don't want to be that person anymore. I don't want to carry that hate around. For a moment, John remained silent, his gaze still steady. But there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, something softer. Then, after a pause, he stepped aside, opening the door wider. Come in, Tom, John said quietly. We can talk. But this isn't just about words. Remember, it's about actions. Tom stepped inside, feeling both a sense of relief and trepidation. As he sat down, the weight of the moment settled on his shoulders. He wasn't sure where this conversation would lead, but he knew that this was the first real step toward the redemption he sought. The two men talked for hours, and Tom found himself opening up in ways he never had before. He spoke of the years of bitterness he had carried, the influence of his father's prejudices, and the pain he had caused by clinging to outdated beliefs. He spoke about his regret and his desire to change, not just for himself, but for the community he had lived in for so long. John listened, his expression calm, but his mind clearly working through everything Tom was saying. There were no grand speeches, no emotional outbursts, just the quiet exchange of truth. And in that moment, Tom realized that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But it would be worth it. He wasn't just trying to make things right with John, he was trying to make things right with himself. As the sun began to set, John leaned forward, his voice steady. Tom, it's a start. But I hope you understand this isn't just about you and me. It's about everyone you've hurt along the way. The town. The people who've come to your diner for years and who have now seen the side of you they didn't know existed. Tom nodded solemnly. I understand. And I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. I'll prove to you, to everyone, that I can change. John stood up and extended his hand. I hope you do, Tom. I really do. But actions speak louder than words. Tom took his hand, feeling a sense of both relief and responsibility. Thank you, John, for giving me this chance. I won't waste it. As Tom left John's house that evening, he felt as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. But a new one had replaced it. The journey ahead would be filled with challenges. And he knew that the road to redemption wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long time, Tom believed that change was possible not just for himself, but for the entire town. And he was ready to start making that change, one step at a time. The days following Tom's visit to John's house were marked by a quiet sense of anticipation. Tom had no illusions about the difficulty of the task ahead. He had made a promise to himself, and to John, that he would change. But knowing where to start was the hardest part. Tom's mind constantly wandered to the words John had spoken about actions speaking louder than words. What could he do? How could he show the town and himself that he was committed to breaking the cycle of hatred and prejudice? The town, too, was changing. Word of Tom's apology had spread quickly, though not all the reactions were positive. Some of the regulars who had supported Tom for years were skeptical, unsure of whether he could truly change. Others, however, saw the apology for what it was, an opportunity for growth and redemption. And while Tom had always believed that the diner was just a place for food and conversation, He now realized that it had become a symbol of division for some, and hope for others. Michael Carter, John's son, continued his efforts to help steer the community towards healing. He had spoken to several influential members in town, explaining his father's position and the profound change he was hoping for. Slowly but surely, people began to come around. The town began to discuss what had happened. And while some conversations were uncomfortable, there was also a growing sense of hope that things could improve. As for Tom, he couldn't ignore the looks he received when he walked down the street. The whispers, the sideways glances. It was as if the community was waiting to see what he would do next. And, in a way, they were right to wait. He had said he was going to change, but words were not enough. Change had to be seen. Tom started by closing the diner for a day, something he hadn't done in years. Instead of preparing meals for customers, he spent the day cleaning the restaurant from top to bottom. As he scrubbed counters and wiped down the booths, he thought about the legacy of his father and the role that Tom's Diner had played in the community. The diner had always been a place where people came to escape their troubles. But now Tom realized that it had become a place where some people felt excluded, judged, and even hated. That evening, after hours of work, Tom stood in the diner, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. The space felt different somehow. It was empty except for the ghosts of his past. And yet, there was a sense of newness in the air, a possibility of a fresh start. But Tom knew that a clean restaurant wasn't enough. It was a clean slate he needed, the kind that could only come with forgiveness and action. He didn't waste any time. The next morning, as the sun rose over the sleepy town, Tom made a phone call. He reached out to several local organizations, including the NAACP and a local veterans group, asking for advice on how to make his diner a place that was welcoming to everyone, regardless of their race or background. He wanted to create a space where people could gather and share stories, find support, and, most importantly, learn to see each other as equals. The first step was small but significant. Tom invited the local veterans group to meet at the diner for a breakfast. It was a modest gesture, but it was a beginning. He wanted to show the town that he could honor their service, regardless of their race or background. The breakfast was a success. People came, ate, and shared their stories. It wasn't perfect, there were still moments of awkwardness, but it was a step in the right direction. As the days passed, Tom continued to make changes. He reached out to local community leaders, offering to host events that would bring people together to talk about race, unity, and healing. The idea of transforming the diner from a symbol of division into one of healing took root. And slowly, more and more people started to believe in it. For the first time in a long time, Tom began to feel a sense of peace. The weight on his shoulders was still there, but it wasn't as heavy. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. But with each small action, he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. He could feel his own heart changing, opening up to the possibility of forgiveness and redemption. And as he stood in the diner one evening, looking at the photographs of soldiers, veterans of all races who had served together, Tom Harris realized that he wasn't just changing the diner. He was changing himself. He was no longer the man who had closed his heart off to others, who had been blinded by prejudice. He was a man trying to make things right, one step at a time. The diner, now filled with the sound of laughter and conversation, was a place of transformation. It was no longer just a diner. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when people came together, when they chose to see each other as human beings, not as labels. And it was here, in the heart of this small southern town, that Tom Harris would learn that it wasn't too late to start over, that it wasn't too late to change. The transformation of Tom's Diner had been slow but steady. The walls, once filled with reminders of a time when division reigned, now displayed pictures of diverse veterans and their stories of camaraderie. Each picture, each item, told a tale of shared sacrifice, illustrating how people from all walks of life could come together for a greater cause. The diner no longer felt like a place where old wounds were picked at. Instead, it had become a space where healing was possible. As weeks passed, the diner saw more and more regulars coming in, not just to grab a bite to eat, but to participate in the conversations that had begun to take root. The community was changing. People who had once avoided each other now found themselves sitting together, sharing meals and stories. The once awkward silences had been replaced with laughter, even tears, as people opened up about their struggles and triumphs. One afternoon, as Tom wiped down the counter, he looked up to see a familiar face entering the diner. It was Sarah, the waitress who had worked with him for years. Her face had always held an expression of concern when it came to the diner's reputation. But now there was a softness in her eyes that Tom hadn't seen before. She walked up to the counter, her movement steady but filled with purpose. "Tom," she began, her voice measured. "I've been thinking a lot about what you've been doing, about how you've changed. I know it's not easy, and I know it hasn't been perfect. But I wanted to thank you. I've seen this town shift. And I've seen it in the way people talk, in the way they look at each other now. It's not about forgetting the past, Tom. It's about moving forward." Tom felt a lump form in his throat. He had never expected such words of gratitude, especially not from Sarah, who had always been so cautious. He had done the work, tried his best, but he had never anticipated how much it would affect those around him. His father's legacy, the pain of old memories, had weighed heavily on him for so long. But now, it was different. It wasn't gone, he couldn't erase the past, but he had made the choice to walk a new path. The conversation with Sarah was a turning point. It was the moment Tom realized that what he had done mattered. The diner, and the journey of redemption it symbolized, had begun to ripple outward, affecting not just his own life, but the lives of those who entered his space. People were witnessing the change, and it made them believe that change was possible for themselves too. It wasn't all smooth sailing. There were still some days when Tom felt the weight of his past actions hanging over him, especially when people came in with expectations that were too high, too soon. But each time doubt crept in, he would remember Michael and John, their unwavering support, and the community that was slowly embracing him. They had taught him that forgiveness wasn't a one-time event, it was a daily choice. A continuous act of moving forward despite the challenges. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tom sat in the diner, gazing out the window. He had just finished a long shift, and the diner was quieter now. The last few patrons had left, and the sounds of silverware and laughter had faded away. But something in the air felt different. It felt like peace, a peace that had eluded him for so many years. In that moment, Tom made a silent vow to continue on this path. No matter how hard it got. He had no idea what the future held. But he knew one thing for certain, he had to be part of the solution. It wasn't just about transforming the diner. It was about transforming himself. And he had taken the first steps unsteadily, but with a sense of purpose he had never felt before. As Tom locked the doors and switched off the lights, he stepped out into the cool night air. The neon sign of the diner flickered behind him, casting a soft glow on the pavement. He didn't know where the journey would take him, but he was no longer afraid to take the next step. The work was far from over, but at least now, he was no longer standing alone.